Welcome to the Møller Institute Leadership Insight. My name is Møller McLaren. It's a great pleasure for me today to have with me Dr. Javier Marcos. Javier started his career with Unilever, but before becoming an internationally recognized expert within sales and client experience, he's associated with the faculty at Judge Business School, and most recently he became an associate professor at Cranfield Business School in the United Kingdom, and we have the pleasure of both knowing each other as associates of Møller. So welcome, Javier.
Thank you, Moray. It is a pleasure to be talking to you today and sharing our dialogue and our discussion with our colleagues at Møller and more widely.
Thank you very much, Javier. When we met last in Cambridge, we wouldn't have imagined that the world would find itself in such an unusual situation with the coronavirus. And of course, 2 weeks ago, we wouldn't have expected to see the social unrest that we're seeing over the last few days within the United States. When we prepared for this session, you told me instead of focusing on sales, you would rather look at politics and politicians and the role of people in public life. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, why would you like to take that as your main focus?
I believe, Moray, that as you rightly said, a lot has changed over the last 3 to 4 months, and indeed over the last 2-3 weeks. And when preparing and reflecting for our dialogue today, I thought inevitably that public figures, fundamentally from policy making, were the ones that I would be referring to elicit and to identify some the traits of leaders and some of the overstated characteristics of them. So it may be that during our conversation, some of the examples and some of the principles of leadership that I may refer to are more applicable to public policymakers, public figures, rather than just leaders of private organizations, whom are the ones I typically deal with.
Perfect. No, I think that's a brilliant idea, Javier. So where do we start then? What if we start off by, what are the traits that you think are important to this particular group?
Yes, thank you for framing this question in this way, because I first believe that there's no a formula for effective or successful leadership. I think leadership as a phenomenon is first socially constructed, so it's something that people develop as a meaning. Is also fundamentally context specific and therefore highly contingent on the situation, the organization, the cultural setting, even the country where you are. So there's no such a thing as a formula for effective leadership, but there are some traits that I find useful in particular contexts. Now, going back to policy making today, it is fair to say that we all feel a bit uncertain and to some extent anxious about recent events. And therefore, I would say that a key feature of a leader today is clarity of communication. That communication, in my view, has to convey a message, an image, a destination that is inspiring for people. That communication has to be balanced and has to connect both with emotional as well as with the factual realities as we experience them and as we live them. So I would say that one of those first characteristics is someone who is able to communicate in an unambiguous clear way.
And are you seeing people with those skills at the moment or not? Are you happy with what you're seeing, or are you disappointed?
I am a bit concerned. Wouldn't say disappointed, but I'm a bit concerned by the fact that clarity of message seems to be very often compromised. We find ourselves in abundance of information. There's so much you can read, so much you can see, that sometimes that clarity gets really distorted throughout different channels and in a context of very, very high level of information, not always of high quality and not always of information that represents reality.
Because when I was listening to the news this morning, I mean, from Donald Trump, we do see clarity of message his clarity of message is around law and order. But do we think that's the right message for the moment or not?
I think that we need, going back to the original question, we need leaders today that are able to unite rather than to separate and rather to polarize. I have always, had, full respect, and I still have full respect for all beliefs, all orientations, all approaches to, politics, economy, social care, and so on. I still believe that, having your convictions, you can always couple strong convictions, clarity of purpose and message with the ability to unite, the ability to bring together. And I think that's what leaders do. There are, unfortunately, examples of leaders who seem to thrive, in conflict, who seem to thrive when they separate, polarize, and take extreme positions. I believe that those have very short span. Those are the leaders that typically will not pass the test of time. So maybe another trait is that ability to bring together, to cohesively make compatible different viewpoints and different approaches to reality and to managing countries and organizations.
So you're sitting next to Donald Trump. You're going to give him some advice. What are you going to whisper in his ear about what he's going to have to do over the next few days in order to help solve the current situation?
I would advise him to surround himself with people who are able to openly contradict his views, who are openly and feel safe in providing him with alternative views. Because that's another trait of a leader. A leader is able to find that way of reconciling disparate opinions. The best leaders are actually able to balance and to weight the evidence of different approaches, different insights. And that's what I think, if I was sitting next to him, I would say, make sure that you get the best possible advice, and that best advice will typically come as a result of reconciling and weighting different viewpoints and different opinions and positions.
Isn't it interesting? I was reading an article yesterday that was saying that confidence is one of the main traits of a leader, and I wasn't sure the extent to which confidence would be a positive thing, because it allows me to say that I make mistakes, it allows me to ask other people, or at the tipping point to where confidence will actually hold me back from asking the right questions because I have certainty of my own self and my own direction. What do you think?
I think you can be confident, and I would agree with you, Maury, that confidence is a sought after trait in a leader. I would say that you can be confident but humble at the same time. So being confident in your principles, in your beliefs, and staying true to those beliefs does not mean that you can be humble, which is another trait I find useful and needed these days. And being humble is the ability to consider other alternatives that you may not have thought about. Being humble is knowing that no matter how well trained you are, no matter how expert or how knowledgeable, there will always be something you cannot access. There will also always be something you cannot know, and therefore knowing that you, as a person, as an individual, you are by definition limited. I think is also an important trait that will help people in leading and in powerful positions. Again, convene, contrast, unite.
Yeah.
And I think those are approaches that we need these days.
Yeah, and both of us spend time with Møller doing executive training. We get the top executives from around the world and we help them on these skills. Are we saying that people are born humble, or are we saying that we can actually help them become humble in their approach?
I can't think of any trait that cannot be developed. And as you rightly say, the work at the Møller Institute actually, I think is grounding on that strong belief that leadership is a state of mind, is a state of development that can be trained in people, that can be nurtured. In the same way that accountants or pilots or carpenters or plumbers are not born, they are made. I believe that leaders are made. You obviously may have certain personality traits that make you more likely to succeed in a particular leadership role in a particular context. But leadership, like carpentry or plumbing, can be learned, can be developed.
So we're doing a training next week, and we've got Donald Trump in the room. I'm just thinking through. I mean, somebody must have had Donald Trump in his classroom at some stage. Someone must have had him as a young child in his classroom. I don't know whether you have to hit someone over the head with a big stick in order to get them to accept this, or whether you can educate them. Let's come back to that at the end. So we're talking about the traits you admire most. Can you think of any particular leaders or people that you know who have been able to show those traits? I mean, who for you has been someone that you admire?
If I think about people that I have admired or people who have inspired me, one of the first persons that come to mind is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, as you know, was an individual who displayed a set of traits that really helped in bringing about the transformation that he was instrumental in South Africa, and I would argue, beyond. One interesting fact is, if you remember when he died, he was able to convene more than 130 heads of state. That's something that doesn't happen very commonly. So I think that if we go back in history, things that I found admirable about Nelson Mandela was his determination, his ability to bounce back from adversity, and also his ability to keep some fundamental beliefs alive. For instance, he got married for the third time when he was 80. He also lost a daughter when he was very young. And indeed, in my view, one of the most dramatic but also inspirational actions, it was the ability to survive, I mean mentally, 27 years of imprisonment. That's something that I think tells a lot about himself, not just as a political leader, but fundamentally as an individual.
Yeah, no, very true. So I was 18 in 1984, and it was Nelson Mandela that inspired me to go into a Sainsbury's supermarket. You'll know Sainsbury's in England, on a Saturday afternoon, fill my shopping trolley with my friends with South African fruit. I have to apologize to all of my South African friends I work with at the moment. We'd go with a trolley full of South African fruit, would then go to the checkout and refuse to pay it, and they'd have to call the police. That was our civil disobedience against the regime that we saw in South Africa at the time. And not only was I surprised by the message, I was motivated by the message from Nelson Mandela. For me, the key element was how to come out of prison after 27 years and be able to embrace the same people that had put you into prison and that had caused you all of that suffering.
Correct.
How to, what is it? Something about putting your own ego into neutral, and something about forgiving. I mean, I don't know whether forgiving is the right word, because it obviously it goes much beyond forgiving. What is it that enabled Nelson Mandela to allow a space for people like de Klerk to come into and to embrace them and to work with them?
I think it was a fundamental redefinition of how human relations should be framed. And as you rightly say, Nelson Mandela was able to fight that very notion of racism, avoiding at every time being afraid of it. So he never showed back, or he never reciprocated the things and experiences that he suffered. And that's again something that should be noticed. I also read that he was an avid runner, and that he really found inspiration in keeping a very strict physical exercise regime. And legend goes that he actually turned his bodyguards mad when he would wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. to go for a run. So that's another element. I think great leaders they have some routines, some habits that they fall back to when things get tough. Those are habits that sustain them physically and mentally. And I think it's also important to look at the leader as a holistic person who has obviously physical as well as mental and emotional needs.
So let's go back to this question of status and ego and how people deal with their own ego as a leader. In 1995, after the Dayton Agreement was signed, I was invited by the UN to go to Sarajevo to do a negotiation training for the peacekeepers. One of the Nobel Prize Committee, Gunnar Stalsett, came with us. He'd been working on the peace process in the Middle East. And he said, if you're working on a peace process, one thing you have to do is stand back and allow the parties to communicate, and your role as a leader was a facilitator. His process ended. He was at the airport on the way home, and he saw CNN announcing that the next mediator was going to be Jimmy Carter. And he knew at that moment Jimmy Carter would fail because Jimmy Carter put his face at the front of that negotiation process, his status, his prestige, his personality. Now, many years later, I found out that Gunnar Stalsett was a bishop of Norway. And I've always wondered whether, I mean, he didn't even tell me he was a bishop of Norway, and I spent a week with him. I wonder whether there has to be a separate drive or motivation for people, which is wider and bigger as a feeling of purpose than their own self, status and personality. And I wonder what that would mean to Nelson Mandela, what his driving force would be.
Yes, I believe that for a good leader, their purpose is always above and beyond their egos.
Yeah.
The mission they are about to serve, or the mission they're serving, becomes more important than themselves. And I think that is a reasonable statement that can actually hold true, across a number of contexts, and also across a number of different situations and leaders.
So how interesting. Something else I heard is that Paul McCartney, he gives millions of dollars every year to charity, but only on the basis that no one knows that he is donating that money to them. Doesn't it go contrary to a lot of what we see and a lot of the behaviors we have? So if you were to think about the positive world leaders at the moment, who would you put into that frame? Or do you think that we do seem to have a lack of suitable leaders at this time in history?
I think there is, in some contexts, there is a lack of leadership. And let me explain this, why I choose the word leadership as opposed to the word leader. By definition, and based on what we are discussing, Moray, I believe that leadership is, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning, is a socially constructed phenomenon. Therefore, is the combination of a number of elements, all of which actually go beyond a single individual. So I'm not sure whether today we have a lack of leaders, but I think we need to rethink leadership. And I think we need to reinvigorate and nurture and redefine leadership in a number of different contexts. And I believe in this because the challenges and the opportunities as well that we have facing us are much more complex than everything we have experienced before. So there's only one way, which is to bring that collective wisdom that can be enabled and can be channeled by an individual or a small group of individuals. But I think what we need now is more leadership, not necessarily more leaders.
Very interesting. And just to finish off, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing in the leadership globally, what would it be? What would be your wish going forward?
If I would have that magic wand, I would use it to help leaders and leadership become comfortable with paradox, and I would use it to get people into a frame of mind that allows to make reconcilable competing demands. I would use it to get people to observe and appreciate completely contradictory viewpoints and pieces of information. I would use it to get people to see the union in the difference, or the diversity in the adversity.
That's absolutely brilliant, Javier. I'm just wondering aloud, if I had the magic wand, that we might be using that on Donald Trump if we had him in our training session next week, no? So
I would use that, widely, not just with one single individual, but with many.
It's very unfair to talk about one individual, but it's an individual who is in the news at the moment. So,
absolutely.
Thank you very much for your time, Javier. You will be sitting in my seat next week, so you will get a chance to interview somebody. And I look forward to meeting with you again, face to face at some stage, and continuing the conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and looking forward to meeting you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.